At 6:30 a.m. on September 15, 1944, a German reconnaissance pilot flew over the town of Bettemberg in Luxembourg. He looked down and saw a terrifying sight. The American 6th Armored Division had arrived. He counted hundreds of M4 Sherman tanks parked in the fields. He saw artillery batteries dug into the tree lines. He saw heavy trucks moving in convoys. He radioed his findings to the 21st Panzer Division stationed just across the Moselle River. Massive American armor buildup. Prepare for heavy resistance. The German commanders halted their advance. They dug in expecting a sledgehammer blow from 30,000 American troops and 500 tanks, but from 2,000 feet the German pilot couldn't see the truth. The tanks weren't made of steel. They were made of inflated rubber. The artillery was made of sewage pipes. And the massive army was actually a group of 1,100 art students, set designers, and sound engineers from New York who were holding a 75-mile front with nothing but air pressure and paint. In the next 48 hours, this ghost army would pull off the biggest con job of the war. They would stop a Panzer division dead in its tracks without firing a single anti-tank round. They violated every rule of military doctrine because they weren't fighting with bullets, they were fighting with perception. And their weapon wasn't the Browning machine gun, it was a 93-pound balloon that looked exactly like a 30-ton killing machine. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops was the most bizarre unit in the U.S. Army. They didn't recruit from boot camps, they recruited from Pratt Institute, Cooper Union, and the art schools of Philadelphia. The men were painters, sculptors, fashion designers, and architects. The Army had a specific physics problem. How do you move a tank division without moving a tank division? The answer lay in visual displacement. If you could make the enemy believe a tank was there, he would react as if it were there. But the engineering required to fake a tank was incredibly complex. The challenge was the M4 Sherman. It was a beast of angles and shadows. You couldn't just build a wooden box. The decoy had to cast the right shadow at 3 p.m. It had to sag correctly on its suspension. And most importantly, it had to be portable. The engineers developed a pneumatic solution, a neoprene-coated fabric balloon supported by a skeletal framework of collapsible tubes. When deflated, the entire tank fit into a duffel bag and weighed just 93 pounds. A single Jeep could carry 3 tanks, but the genius was in the inflation. They used high-pressure air compressors powered by the Jeep's engine. In 20 minutes, a flat piece of rubber transformed into a 3-dimensional turreted weapon. The artists then hand-painted the rubber with olive drab paint, adding mud splatter, rust, and unit insignias. They were so detailed that from 100 yards away, even American generals couldn't tell the difference. But a visual fake wasn't enough. A Panzer division doesn't just look scary, it sounds terrifying. A column of tanks creates a specific acoustic footprint, a low-frequency rumble that travels through the ground for miles. If the Germans looked and saw tanks but heard silence, the game was up. So the 23rd recruited sound engineers from Bell Labs. They created the Sonic Deception Unit. This was audio engineering weaponized. They went to Fort Knox and recorded real armored divisions. They didn't just record noise. They recorded the specific squeak of a tank tread turning a corner. They recorded the clanking of mess kits. They recorded sergeants shouting orders. They transferred these sounds onto wire recorders, the ancestors of the tape cassette, but playing them back required power. They couldn't use normal speakers. They needed to project sound 15 miles across a battlefield. The engineers built massive 500-pound speakers mounted on half-tracks. These weren't PA systems, they were acoustic cannons. They could output sound at decibels that vibrated the chest. But the physics of sound is tricky. High-frequency sounds like a whistle dissipate quickly. Low-frequency sounds like an engine rumble travel long distances but are non-directional. The Bell Labs engineers mixed the audio tracks to account for atmospheric attenuation. They knew that sound changes depending on the weather and terrain. They created sound scenarios. They could mix these tracks live like a DJ at a nightclub, creating a symphony of war that convinced German listening posts that an entire army was waking up. By September 1944, the Ghost Army was deployed to Luxembourg. The situation was critical. General Patton's Third Army was stretched thin. There was a massive gap in the American line near Bettemberg, a hole big enough for a Panzer division to drive through and cut the Allied forces in half. The army didn't have real tanks to plug the hole, so they sent the 23rd. 1,100 artists were told to hold the line against the seasoned killers of the 21st Panzer Division. They arrived at night. This was the atmosphere. They inflated 60 dummy tanks in the dark, but they didn't just park them. They practiced track discipline. If a real tank drives into a field, it leaves massive ruts in the mud. An inflatable tank leaves no tracks. If a German reconnaissance plane saw a tank sitting on pristine grass, he would know it was a fake. So the artists used bulldozers to tear up the ground before placing the balloons. They created fake tracks leading up to the decoys. They even scattered empty ration cans and cigarette butts around the tanks to make it look like a crew had been living there. It was method acting on an industrial scale. Then the sonic unit took over. They drove their speaker trucks to the edge of the river. They pointed the acoustic cannons at the German lines. At 11 p.m. they dropped the needle. The sound of a heavy bridge building column roared across the valley, clanging steel, revving engines, the sound of a 40-ton Sherman shifting gears. On the German side, the listening posts went frantic. American engineers are bridging the river. Heavy armor is crossing. The German artillery opened fire. They shelled the empty riverbank for hours, wasting thousands of rounds of ammunition on invisible ghosts. The artists in their foxholes just watched the fireworks, praying a stray shell wouldn't hit a speaker truck. But the deception had to be perfect. The Germans had spies everywhere. If a local civilian walked past the American camp and saw 4 men lifting a tank over their heads, the secret would be out. So the 23rd created special effects soldiers. These men went into the local towns wearing patches of other divisions. The 6th armored the 75th Infantry. They sat in cafes. They got drunk. They talked loudly about moving out tomorrow and waiting for the rest of the battalion. They were planting rumors. They knew the spies were listening. This was radio deception without a radio. It was human intelligence poisoning, and it worked. The German spies reported back the Americans are loose and confident. The town is full of 6th armored patches. But back at the inflatable line, a crisis was developing. The weather turned. A heavy rainstorm hit Bettemberg. And here the physics of air pressure versus water weight threatened to ruin everything. The inflatable tanks were designed for dry weather. When the rain pooled on the rubber barrels, the weight caused them to sag. A real gun barrel is made of steel, it doesn't droop. A rubber barrel filled with air does. As the artists watched, the barrels of their terrifying Sherman tanks began to curl downward like wilted flowers. If the rain stopped and a German plane flew over, they would see an entire division of tanks with limp guns. The gig would be up. The commander, Colonel Harry Reeder, ordered the men out into the storm. They couldn't use internal supports, they didn't exist. They had to use civilian engineering. They grabbed bamboo sticks, broom handles, and tree branches. They ran from tank to tank, propping up the rubber barrels, frantically trying to keep the illusion erect. At dawn, the rain cleared. The German reconnaissance plane returned. The pilot looked down. He saw the tracks. He saw the tanks. He saw the barrels pointing straight at him. He didn't see the broomsticks hidden underneath. He didn't see the artists holding their breath. He saw an army ready to kill. He banked his plane and flew back to report. The Panzers stayed put. The bluff held. But this was just a rehearsal. The real test, the one that would determine the fate of the war in Europe, was coming months later at the Rhine River. Operation Viersen, where the Ghost Army would have to trick not just a division but the entire German high command. And for that they needed a deception so big that it would leave the industrial heart of Germany defenseless. The date was March 18, 1945. The location was the Rhine River, the last natural barrier protecting Nazi Germany. The 9th Army was preparing to cross. If they failed, the war could drag on for another year. The Germans had massed their remaining artillery and panzer units on the far bank, waiting to slaughter the first boat that touched the water. The plan was simple but insane. The real crossing would happen at Wesel. But to make it work, the Ghost Army had to convince the German high command that the attack was coming 10 miles south at Viersen. They had to simulate not just a division but 2 entire divisions, 30,000 men, using only 1,100 artists. It was the ultimate test of multimedia warfare. Visuals and sound were not enough for this scale. They needed radio deception. The Germans were experts at triangulation. They listened to American radio frequencies, measuring the signal strength from 3 different points to pinpoint exactly exactly where a headquarters was located. The 23rd's radio operators, many of them former commercial telegraphers from Western Union, knew the physics of the fist. Every Morse code operator has a unique rhythm like a fingerprint. Some are heavy on the keys, some are fast. If a German listener heard a new fist, they knew a new unit had arrived. So the Ghost Army operators didn't just send fake messages. They studied the fists of the real operators from the 30th and 79th Divisions. They practiced for hours until they could mimic the exact tapping rhythm of the real units. They created a radio net so complex that it handled the traffic of 30,000 men. They sent requests for fuel orders for ammunition and urgent calls for chaplains. They broadcasted flash traffic high-priority messages at specific intervals to simulate a command post ramping up for an attack. The Germans intercepted these signals. Their triangulation maps showed a massive buildup of 2 full divisions at Viersen. The German generals moved their heavy artillery south, aiming their guns at an empty field. On the ground, the artists were working 24 hours a day. They inflated 600 dummy tanks and trucks, but the terrain was flat and German observers were watching from across the river. The deception had to be flawless. They used flash discipline. At night, a real army strikes matches, opens tent flaps and drives with blackout lights. If the Ghost Army camp was totally dark, the Germans would know it was fake. So the artists built flash simulators. They rigged timed explosives and flashbulbs to mimic the muzzle flashes of artillery. They lit controlled fires to simulate mess halls. They even drove the few real trucks they had in loops. A truck would drive into the camp with full headlights, turn off its lights, drive out the back way in the dark, circle around, and drive in again with lights on. To a German observer counting headlights, it looked like a convoy of hundreds of trucks arriving all night long. On March 23rd, the trap snapped shut. The Germans were fully committed to Viersen. Their guns were trained on the inflatable tanks. Their reserves were waiting for the ghost soldiers. And then 10 miles to the north, the real 9th Army launched the assault. The river exploded, but at Wessel, the resistance was light. The Germans had been completely outflanked. By the time they realized the mistake, the Allies were across the Rhine. The industrial heart of Germany was open. The Ghost Army watched from their foxholes as the sky to the north lit up. They had held the attention of the enemy just long enough. But as the Allied armies raced into Germany, the men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops received their final order. It wasn't a commendation. It wasn't a medal. It was an order of silence, classified top secret. They were told to pack up their balloons, destroy their recordings, and never speak of what they had done, not to their wives, not to their children. They were ghosts, and ghosts don't exist. The unit disbanded in 1945. The artists went back to New York. Bill Blass became a fashion icon. Ellsworth Kelly became a famous painter. Art Kane became a photographer. They lived their lives in the spotlight, but they carried a secret in the dark. For decades, military historians couldn't understand certain anomalies in the war records. Why did German divisions retreat when no Americans were there? Why did artillery fire at empty fields? The answers were locked in a Pentagon vault. The existence of the Ghost Army was kept secret because the U.S. Army wanted to use the same techniques against the Soviets during the Cold War. It wasn't until 1996, more than 50 years later, that the files were finally declassified. The world learned that the men who saved the 9th Army weren't commandos. They were artists who understood that in war, the greatest weapon isn't always the one that kills. Sometimes it's the one that lies. It was about a specific psychological weakness in the German military mind that they exploited. The German army was built on logic, doctrine, and rigid structure. If they saw a tank, they assumed it was a tank. If they heard a bridge being built, they assumed a bridge was being built. They couldn't conceive that their enemy would waste resources on a theater production. The artists of the 23rd understood that war is not just about ballistics, it is about cognitive bias. They didn't paint tanks, they painted what a German expects a tank to look like. They purposely left mistakes like a soldier carelessly hanging his laundry on a gun barrel because those small human details sold the lie better than the tank itself. They engineered a reality that was too detailed to be fake. For 75 years, the men of the Ghost Army watched World War II movies and saw the 101st Airborne and the Marines get the glory. They saw monuments built for the men who fired the bullets, but there were no monuments for the men who pumped air into balloons. They attended attended reunions in secret. They couldn't apply for veterans' benefits related to their specific missions because those missions didn't exist. It wasn't until 2022, nearly 80 years after they packed up their speakers, that the United States government finally acknowledged the debt. President Biden signed a bill awarding the Congressional Gold Medal to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. By then, only 9 of the original 1,100 men were still alive. They were nearly 100 years old. One of them, Seymour Nussenbaum, who had built the fake patches, said simply, "We blew up tanks with air, and we saved 30,000 lives by doing it." The Ghost Army proved that in the calculus of war, imagination is as lethal as gunpowder. They held the line with rubber. They fought panzers with sound waves, and they walked away without leaving a single footprint in history until now. Today, if you visit the National Museum of the U.S. Army, you can see one of the few surviving inflatable Shermans. It looks ridiculous. It looks like a toy. But if you stand next to it and close your eyes, you can almost hear the sonic speakers playing the sound of a bridge being built, and the frantic radio calls of a German general realizing too late that he has been tricked by ghosts.